Hey everybody, welcome to Platform Con 2024. I hope you're having a great time so far and learning a lot about platform engineering and internal developer platforms. Thank you for joining me today to hear about some of our lessons learned from building internal developer platforms for our enterprise clients. My name is Lorne Stalker. I'm a principal consultant for Global Logic here in the UK and Ireland region. I'm a software engineer by trade, but for the last few years, I have been working with our clients to help them accelerate software delivery and improve developer experience through implementing internal developer platforms. Now, this talk today is not solely based on my own experience. It's really a collective experience of the great team we have in the platform engineering space at Global Logic. I'm going to share some of our lessons learned from building platforms for enterprise clients. And my hope is that regardless of where you are on your platform journey, that you will take something away that can help you, whether that's by saving you time or giving you something to think about that you hadn't considered. That is my hope. So let's start off with our first lesson learned, and that is to pick a primary driver. Now, there are many benefits that you will achieve by adopting platform engineering practices or building an IDP for your enterprise. You may have read about some of these: improving developer experience, cost optimization, decreasing time to market, standardizing technology tool chains, and so on. It's really tempting when we're starting out any platform engineering initiative to say, this is why we're doing it, and list all of those benefits. Now, what we've found works really well with our clients is having them focus on a primary driver and maybe at most one secondary driver. For example, choosing to focus on improving developer experience. Now, this isn't to say that you won't achieve the other things. For example, improving developer experience can lead to reduced time to market for new products. But having that primary focus, that primary driver, is really important when it comes to prioritizing the product roadmap and when it comes to making some of those tricky decisions on how to implement certain things within the platform. Let's look at a couple of examples from two different clients. Now, one had the primary driver of cost optimization. Their entire platform initiative came about as a way to reduce cloud spend. And we'll compare that with another client who had the primary focus of making developers self-sufficient and improving the developer experience. Now, these different primary drivers led to different decisions being taken by the product team. For example, the platform team focused on cost optimization opted for a very high level of abstraction, where teams would essentially define workloads at a very abstract level, and the platform could then choose where to run those workloads in the most cost-effective manner. The platform focused on developer experience, on the other hand, found that their developer community wanted flexibility in the abstractions. They opted, therefore, to have sensible defaults, which would allow that hands-off platform experience if teams chose that. However, they allowed developers to move down the layer of abstraction by overwriting some of those sensible defaults and taking a little bit more control of the way that things were deployed. Now, did the first team focused on cost optimization improve developer experience? Yes. Before there was a platform, getting infrastructure to run anything was a nightmare. And did the second client reduce costs? Yes, by setting sensible defaults on workloads and standardizing the infrastructure in the background, it was easier to apply cost savings and FinOps practices. But the degree to which they achieved these secondary goals was different. And this leads to another learning, which is that abstractions are personal. They're personal to you as a platform, and they're personal to your enterprise. Now, it can be tempting when you're starting out on your platform journey to see an abstraction being presented at a talk, maybe at Platform Con, or to read something in a blog post and think, that looks good, I want to use that. Now, I would encourage you to move away from that tendency. Abstractions are essentially your codified standards, your opinionated way to do something as a company. Your abstractions, the level of them, the naming conventions, the amount of configurability or the variations that you offer should all be driven by your development community, the needs of those teams, and your primary driver. What is it you're trying to achieve as a platform? Now, this next learning is something that we actually see a lot of, especially over the last couple of years, as internal developer platforms were really becoming more well known, more talked about. And that is confusing an internal developer portal for an internal developer platform. Now, this language is something that, as a platform engineering team and within your development community, you need to be really clear on, and you need to make sure that when speaking to senior stakeholders, that you're very clear on the terminology. Now, standing up an instance of Spotify Backstage and installing some plugins does not mean that you have a developer platform. Now, there's nothing wrong with Backstage. It's a really great framework for building developer portals. We've used it with clients. We also use it ourselves internally for our own developer platform. But it's the tip of the iceberg. This is the point that I'm trying to make here, is that there is so much more under the surface of the water that makes your platform compelling, that makes the services that you offer to development teams possible. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't start off with a portal. In fact, many of our minimum viable platforms with clients have been portals, and these portals are maybe used to surface documentation to help teams achieve certain things. Even Spotify's Golden Paths originally started out as documented processes for doing things at Spotify, and then that evolved and Backstage grew out of that. But with that being said, starting with a portal is okay, but you need to go further to make the platform compelling. And this is a typical example of a multi-cloud IDP that we would see with an enterprise client. As you can see, Backstage up the top is a small part of a very big picture. And this brings me to my next lesson learned, which is to bring other teams along on the journey. What do I mean by other teams? Well, a typical one of our enterprise clients may have teams responsible for some of these underlying parts of your IDP. For example, I've highlighted in orange here an example of how platform teams or technology teams might be structured. You may have a team that's responsible for the AWS platform. You may have a team that's responsible for HashiCorp Vault as a platform. Now, these are core parts of your IDP. You don't want to replace the work that those teams are doing. You want to bring them along on the journey. Something that we've found works really well in this scenario is to create a team who take ownership of the developer control plane and the integration and delivery plane. Now, you may have parts of that, for example, CI/CD owned by other teams. That's not a problem. They would essentially become another orange box on this diagram, and they would be another team that came along on the journey. Now, how this works is that this platform team essentially become the developer experience or engineering enablement team. And we've applied a bit of a team topology type lens on this, and you can see that that team essentially acts as an interface between the development community and the underlying technology teams. For me, this essentially makes them the product team for the internal developer platform as a product. They will likely own things like the developer portal, maybe Spotify Backstage, the engineering knowledge base, CLI tools, IDE plugins, etc. They will also likely guide and define the abstractions that teams consume services from the platform via. Their most important job is bridging the gap between the development community and the underlying technology teams. For example, with one client that we've worked with, this team created the engineering standards around how to define workloads and how to make infrastructure requests of the platform. They chose to use Helm and Crossplane respectively for those things. And part of this team's job then became to work with the underlying teams, the underlying platform or technology teams, to help them create abstractions for their services in a way that was consistent with the naming conventions, the level of the abstraction, the way that they were consumed, to make sure that that experience was consistent for the development community. They also work with the product teams, people building products on the platform, to help them migrate existing workloads to the platform. Which leads me to another important learning, especially for our enterprise clients, which is to consider your brownfield products. Now, in the early days, a lot of our conversations about IDP started with enterprise clients saying they wanted to be able to build new products in a day or quickly. But the more we worked with them in this space, the more we started to realize that there isn't actually a huge amount of truly greenfield development, product development takes place. There's some, but generally what we found that they really wanted was to be able to accelerate the rate of change and innovation for their existing products. Now, it's subtle, but this difference makes the way that you approach building your platform different. Greenfield is actually pretty easy. You can craft opinionated templates, you can define some reusable infrastructure components, you can put it all in a templated repository, you can spin up Kubernetes clusters, put Backstage in front of it all, and then people can come and spin up new products relatively quickly. But when it comes to brownfield or existing products, you need to carefully consider your approach. For example, the client I've been working most closely with recently have made this really great decision to start with their most valuable existing products on their IDP journey. And based on that decision, they have made some choices to help phase one be a migration for those existing products that isn't too big an ask. For example, they are allowing these existing products to bring their existing compute clusters and have them be managed by the central IDP cluster rather than asking them to migrate their workloads entirely. It's a much smaller migration step for those products, and it wouldn't have been possible without considering the migration path for existing products. It also brings me to our next learning, which is to know your non-negotiables. So we saw the reference architecture diagram showing all the IDP tooling, and we just spoke about the client I'm working with where they want to start by migrating existing products. Now, ultimately with that client, we would love to centralize the creation and management of those compute clusters. It would allow us to standardize the way in which they were created, the configuration. It would allow us to right size them easier. However, in an aim to make that migration simpler for teams, we chose to relax that, as I mentioned, and let them bring their own cluster. And we also realized that the CI space was very inconsistent. There were different tools. Even within the same tool, there was no standardization around the types of pipeline setup that people had. Again, on our roadmap at some point, we are aiming to standardize this and make it easier for teams to work with. However, to prevent more rework for teams during the migration, we also chose to relax the CI part and create the interface as the image registry. So teams can continue to work with their existing CI setup, and the interface is they publish an image to our Artifactory, and then the platform will pick that up and deploy. We were willing to relax these things, but what we were clear on was our non-negotiables, which were the way in which workloads are defined, the way in which infrastructure is requested, the deployment mechanism that the central management cluster takes to deploy workloads to other clusters, and then some of the other platform tooling like OpenTelemetry for observability, Kyverno for policy as code, ESO for secrets management, and so on. Knowing those non-negotiables, and what we were willing to be flexible on allowed us to create a better migration path for our customers. So by this point, we know what our primary driver is. We've figured out all of our platform tooling. We know the teams that own that, who we want to bring on the journey. We've created our product platform team. We've got our non-negotiables and the things that we're willing to be flexible on to help our brownfield products migrate. And it's time to start laying some strong foundations. Now, this one might sound obvious, it might sound simple, but we have seen clients learn this the hard way, and we also learned it the hard way when we built our own platform for the first time. It's really tempting when you start out to take shortcuts in order to get things moving quicker. This might be having some manual process in the background when you onboard a new application, or not quite having RBAC fully figured out, not considering your day two operations and only thinking about that spinning up new applications quickly. These are all things that need to be considered and built into the platform from day one. If you haven't considered an orchestration layer, for example, and you are just spinning up templated repositories and letting people take ownership of that and change the infrastructure as code, day two operations become very tricky to reel back in the future. For example, if you want to push out a change to upgrade the version of Postgres that you have published as a standard, it becomes really tricky when all you've done is templated a repository that had some Terraform code in it, and teams now have gone off and changed that and adopted their own standards. So consider those key parts, lay the solid foundations, and get off on the right foot. Don't cut any corners, automate everything, and you will be setting yourself on a good path. Now, the final and perhaps most important lesson learned is to measure value. An IDP has the potential to transform the way that your company delivers digital change, but they aren't free. Even if you build it out of open source components, there is a cost associated with building and running the platform. Every enterprise IDP initiative that we have seen has had to report the value that they've delivered to senior leadership, as any good product organization should expect. So it's important, therefore, to measure the value that your platform is delivering from the outset. Initially, when you're starting out, if you're going for the approach of starting with a portal and documenting some golden paths, for example, you might measure KPIs like the number of unique visitors, the number of documents read, and the number of documents completed. You could even go a step further and you could start to measure the time difference. If you value stream map that process that you have created a golden path for before, and then you compare that to the time it takes someone to complete the golden path, you can start to register that value event as a value attributed to the product. As your platform evolves, though, you should make observability and user analytics a key part of everything you do. You should emit data, capture data about everything that happens in the platform. You can then start to measure KPIs that are meaningful to you as a product, that are meaningful to your business, whether that's something like the number of deployments through the platform, or whether it's tied to a business goal or a technology goal. For example, one of the things I've been working with had the goal of running more experiments for their products. The key point here is that you capture and emit data that allows you to measure KPIs and report those to senior management. And that is all of the lessons learned I have for you today. There are obviously many more. If anybody would like to reach out and connect with me on LinkedIn to talk about IDPs some more, this QR code will take you to my LinkedIn page. Thank you very much for joining me for this talk, and I hope you enjoy the rest of PlatformCon 2024.